Good day, everyone. My name is Marcus Dekenau, and I'm co-chair of the SAIEE Load Research Chapter. Today we have three presenters from EPRI giving us a view of EPRI's program for demand response. This is one of a series of presentations by EPRI, which we hope will lead to a program of mutual cooperation with SAIEE membership. Also helping us today are Barry McCall, who is Senior Regional Manager at EPRI, and Mondi Soni, who is Chair of the Load Research Chapter. Now about our speakers, who are all from EPRI's Program 170. Program 170 is all about end-use energy efficiency and demand response. The speakers we have for you today are Dr. Ron Domitrovic, Mr. Chris Holmes, and Dr. Angela Chaung. Dr. Domitrovich is Program Manager, Energy Efficiency and Demand Response Program, Power Delivery and Utilization Sector, EPRI. Ron has extensive experience in design of laboratory and field testing apparatus and evaluation of system performance. Chris Holmes is Technical Executive, Analytics Customer Technologies at EPRI. Chris is an economist by trade. He is a technical executive and utility economist. His position focuses on energy market analysis and insights with focus on changing utility business structures. He provides economic analysis on a wide range of topics, including the regulatory treatment of energy efficiency, demand response, and how their treatment might change under full-scale competition. He is also the co-author of EPRI's Load Shape Library, All Things Load Shapes for the Electricity Sector. Dr. Angela Chaung is Principal Technical Lead, Demand Response at Customer Technologies, EPRI. Angela manages research projects in EPRI's Customer Technology Response Program as Senior Technical Leader. She manages strategic projects for enabling widespread integration of demand response in electric power and market systems, including collaborative R&D projects like EPRI's Flexible Demand Response Demonstration, Demand Response Ready Technologies, and Connected Device Assessments. Okay, and without further ado, I hand over to Ron.
The founding driver of the need for this research about 15 years ago is demand response. Another major driver is energy efficiency, and an emerging and what is becoming a very major driver are the sort of cousins of electrification and carbon reduction. So we look at anything that uses electricity that is stationary. So automobiles and transportation is a separate research program, but everything that's stationary that uses electricity is kind of our purview. And so that's air conditioning and water heating and lighting, data centers, motors, and so forth. All of those, we look at how they're emerging, how they're evolving over time, what new characteristics they have, and how those characteristics can be applied for various reasons within the utility and the utility customer sphere. Very important in that is the understanding of load shapes and how those load shapes change over time due to the nature of the device and how that device is applied. So when you're looking at evolving and emerging customer technologies, they're in all manner of stages of development, from the earliest benchtop research in a laboratory at a university to subtle changes to a mature device. And we try to look at the spectrum of how technologies are evolving. But the bulk of our work, I would say, is related to laboratory and field assessment of relatively early stage devices, but not necessarily benchtop stage. So we work with manufacturers as manufacturers are creating alpha and beta systems for their next generation. That kind of feeds our work. And so a lot of what we do is interface to those manufacturers and help them understand what the utility needs are and what utility applications are and how they might adjust their devices and capabilities to supply that. And demand response is probably one of the front and center purposes or fields that provide lots of valuable information back to the manufacturer about how they can tweak their system or apply their system for the sake of demand response in the utility world. We're divided into four what we call project sets. energy analytics and market insights. That's led by Chris Holmes, who's on the call. That's really the core of our economic analysis, and demand response markets kind of resides within that. Then technology transfer, that's our sort of catch-all for creating bite-sized reports and so forth, and modes of technology transfer out to our membership in such a way that it can be transferred up the chain and sideways and so forth throughout an organization. Technology evaluation, this is really our laboratory and field work where we take actual systems, put them in our set of laboratories that we have in the Knoxville, Tennessee office, and also in the field across the country and really across the world sometimes. And then lastly is Project Set X, which is technology and tool development. That's a little more early stage where we're working with folks to add attributes to their systems that enable things like demand response, or if a system exists that has a capability, but there's poor understanding by either the utility or the utility customer for how to deploy it, we'll develop a tool that assists in that process. And lastly, this is just a collage of our membership, and it's ever evolving. We're always adding folks and so forth. So it's heavy in the United States, but also touches many parts of the world. And so with that, I'll pass back to Chris, and you can take it away.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Let me give you a little bit of context here. I'm an economist, and I've been in the utility business for 30 plus years, and I've done cost studies, and those would be average cost of service and marginal cost of service. Being an economist, I tend to focus more on marginal cost of service. And I then got into the resource planning area and integrating the demand side management, which would include energy efficiency and demand response into resource plans of various utilities, and various large utilities, I might add. Salt River Project, which is a big one in Arizona, which is an interesting case just because it's so hot there that they are driven primarily by air conditioning loads, and we're one of the first utilities to really fully embrace time of use rates based on marginal costs. And then I work for Duke Energy, and then Kansas City Power and Light, and then Tennessee Valley Authority, and now I'm with EPRI, sort of sharing all of those lessons that I've learned. And in that context, what this set of slides is more of something that you can refer to, because I think there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of important concepts, but to cover them adequately in a 20-minute period of time is, I don't think, possible. So instead, what I've done is I've thrown in what I believe are sort of the planning aspects for the design of a program, a DR program. Actually, many of these concepts can be applied to an energy efficiency program or a marketing program in general. But given that, I would implore you to look at these in more detail later on, and if you have any questions, give me a call or an email, and we can talk about them. So with that being said, I have visited your country on a number of occasions, 3 times to be specific, and during those visits, I learned quite a bit about your geography, your utility operations, and your cultures. So although I'm probably can't speak definitively on any of those, but enough to generally understand. So the issue here, though, is that in the United States, we are driven by regulation, and regulation has been around for 70 years. It works pretty well. Back in the early 90s, 1990s, there was an effort to deregulate everything, and during that time, there was a loss of load research, so data being collected on end-use loads, on class loads across the country was almost completely stopped, because in a market electric economy, you can't recover those costs very easily. Whereas in a regulated economy, you can. And now we've sort of come full circle and we're back to more or less more hands-on regulation. And then so there's this regulatory compact. And the only reason why I bring this up is because it does have a bearing on the utilities, at least in the United States, their willingness to embrace demand response when it is cost effective in a regulated environment. And that's where a lot of it exists. And there's a nuance there that I'm going to get to here in a few minutes. You can read all of those. I leave that to you. But the important aspect is that utilities in the United States really only make money on capital investments that they make in the distribution, transmission, and generation systems. So when they use shareholder money to build a new power plant, regulators deem that used and useful capital asset, and then they allow them to earn an authorized rate of return based on some complicated financial methods. And they then earn a rate of return on that. That's basically all they earn money on. They don't make money on capital. They don't make money on labor. They don't make money on fuel, which is a bit of a misnomer, but they don't. And so they were always looking for ways to earn additional revenues or additional earnings. That was what regulators wanted them to do. And one of the things that regulators wanted them to do was participate in energy efficiency. So there were mechanisms that were created to allow them to recover their lost revenues, to recover their program costs, and to earn an additional rate of return. And so that really began to spur the effort by utilities in the area of energy efficiency. In terms of demand response, regulators also want utilities to not always be biased in producing power plants, but rather look for lower cost ways. That's that level playing field for an integrated resource plan. Look at that level playing field. And so demand response became very important as well as a way to overall reduce the costs that the utility was dealing with. And so demand response programs came into effect. And demand response can be a fairly general term. It can be it can refer to actively affecting behind the meter loads. It can also refer to pricing programs, and that's part of this effort as well. Now, here at the end of this slide is the point that I was trying to make a little bit earlier, that the regulatory compact, because the costs can be built into rates and is basically non-bypassable by customers, then the use of the long-run marginal costs is appropriate in rate design and in program design. When you evolve into a more competitive market, then you have markets that are established, buyers and sellers who are looking for different objectives, but generally speaking, everything is based on short-run marginal costs. And when that's the case, then it's very difficult for utilities to recover their investment in demand response capital assets, such things as radio-controlled water heater switches or radio-controlled air conditioners. So it depends on which regulatory model or which business model that you're looking at as to what your program design ultimately should be. And I'm assuming that it's going to be a regulated marketplace for ESCOM and your distributors. Here are a couple of things that sort of differentiate between competitive markets, which is on the left, and this is how competitive markets actually operate. They're basically based on the needs of customers to have power, and they can either hedge, they can speculate, they can arbitrage, they can create markets, and that doesn't leave much room for recovering long-run marginal costs. Whereas in regulated markets, then there's an authorized rate of return. There's all sorts of cost allocations, fuel pass-throughs, and other regulatory assets. So down on the lower left here, where it has average cost of service, marginal cost of service, and market-based pricing, those are the three basic ways that you can evaluate assets, the way you can design rates, and the way you can design programs. All right, so from an economic standpoint, this is my view, marginal costs are very much key, because to the extent that you convey marginal costs, then that is an efficient price signal. And when you have efficient price signal, then consumers can make good consumption decisions and suppliers can make good expansion decisions. And there are three components to it. There's the energy related costs, which is related to mainly fuel and the burning of fuel to produce power over time. And its metric is dollars per megawatt hour. There are capacity related costs, and those are the costs associated with being able to meet the peak demands that are put on the system, and what drives those peak demands. That's typically a dollar per kW metric or a dollar per kilowatt year metric if it's amortized over the life of the capital asset. And then customer related costs, which is all about meter reading and in the distribution system. And there are other relevant cost components here: reserve margins, energy loss factors, capacity loss factors. These become relevant when you are determining the economics of a particular load shape change, be it energy efficiency or demand response. Please note down at the bottom that risk and uncertainty are not included in the calculations, at least in the United States, which is a shortcoming, because there are two equivalent benefit cost ratio programs may have completely different underlying risk assumptions, and you would typically want to go with the one that had the lower risk associated with it, although regulators sometimes don't tend to look at that. All right, so this is how resource planners look at their electric systems. They will look at what their load duration curve is. So they'll take the bus bar, the sum of all the bus bar loads in their power system, and separate out those which are transactions outside of their system, and which they normally can do. And so they'll have a net load duration curve, which is reflective of their obligation to serve in that particular time frame, and they'll do forecasts of that as well. And they'll rank them by demand, or the demand in each individual hour, and then sort them by that from highest to lowest. So over on the left, you can see that the high level is kind of peaky, and that gray box there is what utilities have to be concerned with their obligation to serve, that they've got to have resources that are available, that when hot temperatures hit and everybody's air conditioner comes on and people taking showers and so on and so forth, that they have generating resources able to meet that peak. And as weather or other drivers begin to moderate, then you get to the flatter part of that curve, and then your baseload power plants are the ones that are really driving the economics of that. A nuclear unit is prime for generating and providing power, or providing energy during those flat periods. So it's that peak area in that gray box that demand response is focused on. So to the extent that you can avoid those peak demands, then that has an economic benefit in terms of the avoided capital that's necessary in order to meet that peak. And you can do that through demand response programs. Okay, so there are three forms of demand response. There are economic demand response programs, and these exist when you have put out a rate that is a fixed price rate, but your market conditions are such that prices have spiked. So you are receiving, say, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, but your costs are $100 a kilowatt hour. So there are many programs that are designed then to go to your customers and say, look, if you cut back, that'll save us $100. We'll split that with you. And so you'll give in the form of an incentive $50 back to the customer. The utility keeps 50 either to a portion to retained earnings, to shareholders, or to operating costs. So the second type of demand response program is for long-term reliability and for planning purposes. This is probably the more typical type of design where when you get to those high peaky loads that there are some concerns about system reliability and the obligation to serve to meet those peaks. Therefore, if you can reduce load during those periods of time, then you can put those into your future load forecasts in your resource plan, and then decide whether or not you can defer generating units into the future or eliminate generating units altogether. And this can be done for both generation, transmission, and distribution. When I was doing this many years ago, it was primarily generation. We didn't look at distribution very much. But now we hardly look at generation any longer, and it's distribution that seems to be much more important because there is such an explosion of customer-owned generation and customer end uses, which now are affecting what the loads look like on the distribution system. Things such as electric vehicles, things such as storage and wind turbines. And then the third type of demand response is for just short-term reliability and operational maintain, like to provide voltage and frequency services, ancillary services, distribution level, spatial and temporal requirements. Spatial meaning there may be specific substation concerns that are substations that are overloaded. You need to focus in, and so you can design demand response programs on air conditioners, pool pumps, water heaters, and focus in on those and alleviate the constraints on those local distribution assets. Okay. Now the way we look at these things is based on the economic model created back in 1987, and it's called the California Standard Practice Manual. And it looks at all of the various participants or the affected constituents in a utility, and those are, well, regulators are part of it, but you've got participants, non-participants, and the utility. Those are the three main ones. You got regulators in there as well. And then you also have, if you are developing demand response programs, you have the program administrators. Here in the United States, we often will hire an independent third party who is a program administrator, and they will, the utility just says, we need 50 megawatts of capacity reduction over the next 5 years, and we'll put out an all-source bid to providers, and if some of the bids come back with demand response, and they may, if it's the most cost-effective option, then they will go through a program administrator. Program administrators, though, really are more of a service than they are really an actual asset, if you will. I throw this slide in because oftentimes it gets forgotten, but electricity is a high-value product, and when you affect the delivery of that high-value product to customer, it can have negative consequences. And those consequences are driven really by what customers' needs are. And this is just a slide that points out a few needs, or many others, but these are the ones that we oftentimes see that customers express the most in terms of program acceptance. Things like cost, whether it affects their comfort, whether it's easy to use, whether it gives them control over their daily lives and their use of electricity, how certain or uncertain it happens to be, and then how well it communicates. And there are other obvious needs as well, safety, reliability, things of that nature. These are the ones that we look at a lot, though. Okay, so the economic tests are the participant tests. So if you're designing a program and you don't give the customer anything, but you shut their power down for 2 hours on hot afternoons, their temperature in the house is going to go up, their comfort's going to deteriorate. They want to be compensated for that. So you got to look at what the participant test looks like for them. You need to look at what the rate impact is, because when you're shutting down their power, you're reducing your revenues, but you're also reducing your costs. And as long as your costs drop by more than the revenues from the utility standpoint, it's a good thing. So that would lead you to look at the utility costs. I jumped over the total resource cost. Total resource cost just looks at all of the impacts to participants and non-participants, adds those together, and then looks at what it costs society in order to obtain those resources in terms of the capital to put on switches on the water heater and the billing system that's necessary for the utility to implement, and then what the avoided costs of capacity and energy happen to be, and then any incentives that are paid, and then look at that and see what the impact is to all of those particular or constituents in the utilities jurisdiction. Other things that you want to look at are load shape impacts that a demand response program or an energy efficiency program produces. Is there a rebound after you let the power come back on? Is there, or if you're cycling and you stop cycling, what are you actually getting? Impact evaluation is a very important aspect to this. Many times the manufacturers will overstate because they want higher compensation. So utilities have to be on top of what the true impacts and what the true value is. There is sometimes features such as, which are very customer friendly and opt out. So if you're cycling somebody's air conditioner and the customer is thinking, I don't want to do this anymore, and there's an override button and they opt out, well, that has a distinct impact on what the economics of that particular program. When the customer owns the quantity option, the capacity option for that air conditioner, then that flips the economics around from something that has high value to the utility to something that has much less value. And so when you have design features such as that, you need to incorporate them into the economic evaluation. Persistence is also an issue, as how long people stay on the program. They may get fed up with it and move on. Here, I threw this slide in. I won't give you a test on it, but what it does do is it does give you a guide as to how to calculate those benefit cost ratios to determine whether a program is cost effective from a particular perspective or not. So skipping over that, here's where you would actually calculate. This was done based on a sample energy efficiency program. We would do this exact same calculation for using the template that I just showed you a second ago to determine the benefit cost ratios. You could do it for an energy efficiency program. You could do it for a demand response program. I happen to show an energy efficiency program here. And if you go over that top set of BC ratios where it has the participants. So in this particular case, I think this was like a lighting program. It has a benefit cost ratio of 2.96, which means basically that it's almost 3 times more cost effective to do this particular energy efficiency program than it would be to either buy the power from some other party or to build a resource to do that. So it's got a 2.96. If you look at the ratepayer, however, in this particular case, because the rates were out of alignment with the costs saved, that the revenue impact was much greater than the cost savings. And so from a ratepayer standpoint, it came out less than 1. And in many instances, many utilities don't like that. They would rather not do it than to actually try and get the rates in alignment with what their underlying costs were, so that, and sometimes you can't get your program impacts in alignment with the rates because rates are based on averages and load shape changes are not based on averages. They're based on marginal. And so those get out of alignment. In this particular case, the total resource cost came in at 1.41, which means it's much more cost effective from society's standpoint, 40% more cost effective than purchasing or installing conventional supply side resources. And then this is the utility. Utilities tend to be just really pass through. So even though it is 1.76, but what I wanted to emphasize here is that many utilities in the United States don't like that ratepayer or RIM test that's less than 1. And so they tend to focus on demand response programs, where demand response programs don't really have too much of an impact on the rates, but they do produce a huge amount of capacity savings, and so they like that. And so for demand response programs, you'll see a RIM test that will far exceed 1, 1.5, 2.0, and many utilities gravitate towards that because they like that. They like the impact that it has on their system. Here, I'm sorry, I did grab this one. Here's one where the ratepayer impact from this particular demand response program came in at 3.88. Utilities will like that a lot. Especially if they don't have mechanisms to recover costs for energy efficiency, then they're definitely going to focus in on demand response. Okay. I'm going to zip through these, but these are the basic demand response service design components. This is what you would want to answer and describe in any demand response tariff that you would design. Is what is the notice? How far in advance are you letting customers know that there's going to be an interruption? How many times can it happen? When I worked at TVA, we didn't do any frequency. We could interrupt any time and as many times as we liked, and many customers didn't like that very much, particularly the industrial, but it's not unheard of. How long can the interruption be? Is it, and under what conditions is it? Is it when the economics are good, or when the reliability issues have abated, or when the prices are high, so on and so forth? For customer understanding, usually durations are a set period of time. It can be weekdays from noon to 4 p.m. only, and then customers can understand that. And then when you give them notice, then they know how to respond and have a plan in place. How long is the contract term for? Is it 1 year? Is it 5 years? Is it indefinitely? Typically, utilities like to have contract terms that limit it in case the underlying economics change. And we're seeing that right now with reduced loads throughout. So now the marginal value of capacity is dropping because of the drop in loads. And so you may only want to do it gives you the flexibility, it gives the utility the flexibility to run a program for 2 or 3 years and then put it on the shelf for 2 or 3 years and then bring it back. You lose that continuity, but it may be worth it. And then the quantity that the utility is receiving from the customer, how much capacity are they getting, and how much is that worth? How much should we pay in the form of an incentive? All of those need to be answered when you're designing a program. Which would be good areas to focus on? This was an example that we used in the Tennessee Valley Authority, where we came up with some estimates based on the number of air conditioning units that existed in the service territory. And there really are 2 ways that you can determine what the numbers are, at least here in the U.S., is the federal government does surveys that estimate the number of air conditioning units. The Energy Information Administration, EIA, which is part of the Department of Energy, conducts these surveys every year to find out by census region and census division, which are geographic areas across the United States, how many homes there are, how many homes have air conditioning. So in the Pacific Northwest, on the coast, not so many. In New England, not so many. In the South, lots. And so that's why you'll see, particularly like here with the Tennessee Valley Authority, central AC and direct load control is fairly popular in the southern U.S. Also, water heating. Water heating, not so much in the south of the United States, but much more so for electric water heating in places like the Pacific Northwest, like in the Midwest and in New England. And then there are price response programs. That one's always been a little more difficult for utilities to get a handle on, mainly because it's so behavioral oriented as to how people are responding to price under time of use rates, or getting a price signal only during periods of shortage. And then so we came up with basically technical estimates that if you converted every single air conditioner over, then that would be the savings potential on average. And from that, you can then determine what the adoption rates would be. That's what that lower market acceptance piece is. And from that, you can calculate the general demand. The economics. This just shows how it was done in Tennessee Valley Authority, which runs across 7 states, and particularly residential, and looking at central AC, room AC, and heat pump as potential demand response sectors. I'm coming to the end here. I need to leave some room for Angela. She's got more of the cutting edge things to talk about, so definitely need to leave enough time. But impact evaluation is very important to make sure that the non-participants are not subsidizing the participants. But because from early on in the program evolution, there were many industrial programs that never got called. It was an insurance policy, if you will, but utilities generally didn't like to call it because of the unhappy industrial customers, and they have more political power, I guess. And so it almost became more of a subsidization. But as the programs evolved and markets became more mature, then industrial demand response programs were actually executed, and finding out what the demand response was, the actual yield, became very important to resource planners who are having to look at what generation needs, transmission needs, and distribution needs that they're going to have over the next few years. So these are all important. There are so this is kind of an illustration of when you call a DR event, the load drops, and then what you're trying to do is figure out what that curtailment yield look like. So you have a baseline that's unobserved because it's been affected by the DR, and so the impact evaluation is trying to evaluate something that isn't really directly measurable. But there are a number of different baselines that have been created. I use this first one, last 5 of 10, which just means last 5 days, highest days of the last 10 preceding an event. It could be last 3 of 5. There's a lot of different ways. X of Y is what they call it, but I used in a specific example. Sometimes you see, particularly for high load factor customers like industrial customers, they'll just take the hourly demand the hour before the event was called and use that, draw a straight line, and then compare it to the drop in load. There are statistical estimation methods which have the advantage of trying to capture secondary effects, such as the impact of temperatures and weather on what the load would have been. And so statistical estimation is particularly strong at that. Many of the programs in utilities have what's called a protected level to measure what the demand is. And what that means is that when a call comes, if the load is at 10 megawatts and they have a protected level of 5, then they have to drop down to 5 when that event occurs. And if they go out of compliance, then there may be penalties that are assessed. But it's difficult to really know what they would have been in the absence of that. That's where maybe that 5 of 10 is used to more accurately determine what it is. But many designs do use that protected level. And then for those that have backup generators, an actual metering of the generator is oftentimes I'm sure there's a few that I've missed here, but these are the main ones that I'm familiar with. There are other types of service designs, upfront bill credits, monthly, seasonally, or annually. There's pay for performance, which is not an upfront bill credit, but that when the event comes, they'll do an impact evaluation, say, okay, we got 5 megawatts out of you. We're going to pay you $3.50 per kilowatt month for that, and that's what you get. And so they only pay when the events occur. They're rate-based, which time of use, as I mentioned before. If your rates are in alignment with your underlying costs, DR is less obvious to engage in when you have time of use rates that accurately track the underlying costs to the system. And then opt-outs are important because when you have an opt-out, it definitely alters the underlying economics of the demand response. Okay, that's all I had.
Thank you, Chris. Let's carry on with Angela. Hi, Angela. Welcome. It's good to have you. Please carry on.
Good day, everyone. So what I understand is South Africa is early in the curve of interest in starting demand response programs. So in this presentation, we'll give a broad perspective of the different types of first of all, what we mean terminology-wise by demand response. Also, the early stages to the more advanced stages and the most advanced stages, like a broad perspective of what's going on with demand response in the U.S. as well as other regions in the world, and the different load shape impact objectives we can achieve with demand response, and then some challenges, and ultimately looking at what it takes to connect retail DR. This is where the demand response comes from the customer side of the meter, from the loads, basically, and what it takes to connect it with the needs in the wholesale market and with the utility. If there's no wholesale organized market, there's going to be a wholesale entity that has an interest in the response from the loads and how to connect this response with the needs of the utility. So that's the overview. Terminology and then components to enable DR, the evolution of DR, and what it takes to connect retail to wholesale needs. So terminology-wise, what we mean by demand response, which comes from distributed resources, is demand responses that change in load that's coordinated with system or market needs. And it can come from a number of types of distributed resources. And this somewhat like a Venn diagram, although this is shown not to overlap. There are those types of resources, distributed energy resources, that can actually produce electricity. So that can come from your intermittent renewable type resources or the non-intermittent type resources like distributed generation powered by fossil fuels. You can also lump distributed storage in there, such as stationary storage, and now we see more and more interest in enabling plug-in electric vehicles to provide that coordinated response with system needs, that demand response. There's also loads. I call them demand responsive loads, all kinds of loads that can be leveraged that we see, including thermal energy loads such as water heating load, flexible loads that I'll define that in the next slide, but can rapidly respond to needs with a target increase in consumption too, not just a classical need for reduction. And then there's your interruptible curtailable loads, which just are enabled to reduce basically their electricity consumption, for example, for peak demand reduction. And on the right side of this slide, we show the different ways to look at these distributed resource types based on their ability to, let's say, if they were enabled and programmed to export power to the grid, they can actively produce electricity, or they can just consume, or they could do both. So you've got your distributed resources straddling both sides of the axes because it can do both. So in summary, DR is a change in load coordinated with system market needs. So that's what we mean by DR. demand response objectives vary by, what the needs are of the utility or other type of electricity stakeholder with the interest in demand response. These load shape impact objectives, Chris showed one in the slide. He was showing a reduction in a slide, but that reduction could be from peak clipping. So in peak clipping, you just are after clipping the peak. It could be a seasonal peak, it could be an annual peak, it could be on a particular day, but you want to clip some kind of peak on the grid, peak load on the grid, system-wide, and that's it. But with load shifting, the objective is not only, basically you want to, at the end of the period of time of interest, be using the same amount of electricity, but just in a different way. So that's load shifting. So it's typically reducing some peak somewhere out, but making up for it elsewhere on the curve. So you have the same, I guess, electricity, industrial output in the end, or business output in the end through load shifting. Valley filling, it's interesting because you could just want to target increased consumption to fill a valley in your system, a wide load sometime. And so the load wasn't there, you just want to fill the valley. And then finally, the fourth load shape impact objective is flexible. It's called flexible load shape, but in modern terms, we've been calling it flexible demand response. So this is the ability to, you don't necessarily know in advance, but you can't say a season in advance. You can't even sometimes say a day in advance, but you have this ability to come up with a load shape in operational timeframes that you want to target. You can't say in advance, oh, I want to just clip the peaker. And this is very useful type of objective to balance renewables because renewables are very intermittent in nature. So we see a lot of challenges in achieving these load shape impact objectives from demand response, and they vary by customer sector. What needs to be done is we need to define strategies. So these customers who are in the business, unlike generation companies or independent power producers, renewable entities, they're not in the business of supporting the grid. They might have, like the largest customers might have a requirement to tell the distribution system operator when they're going to turn on a huge process, okay? But the DR strategies here surround what sector are we looking at? And I give a few examples here, ranging from industrial sectors like water pumping, refrigerated warehouses, to commercial sectors like office buildings and retail establishments, but also residences here as well. So depending on the type of sector, they have different types of equipment. And how do we target the equipment to provide the response we need? What can the equipment do in both directions of reducing load and maybe targeting increased consumption in the case of integrating renewables? So those are questions, and per customer sectors, the retail programs would be designed to provide to have a provision in the agreement with the customers to dispatch the load in the direction needed to support the grid at the moment. And there are automation technology challenges because for widespread integration, the customer's response is needing to be automated for widespread demand response, especially with more and more customers and not just large loads, large industrial loads. Automation is very key for widespread integration. There's also customer disincentives because they're not in the business of providing that coordinated response in support of system needs. So overcoming those disincentives and showing what's in it for the customer, those are all among key challenges. Let's move on. So in demand response, this slide shows the stages of advancement. Typically, DR, what I call here DR 1.0, is all about targeting a reduction in load, and it could be for resource adequacy and capacity planning to reduce this, annual peaks. And then it could also be for capturing forward economics on a day-ahead basis. And then moving on, we have what I call grid locational DR, where now utilities are looking at using DR to support their network, such as in distribution management, transformer overload mitigation. This is very important when you have more and more, let's say, electric vehicles charging along the distribution system. So using demand response from electric vehicle charging stations, EVSE, to provide the coordinated response to avoid and to mitigate overload issues on the distribution system. For also transmission or grid or network issues, so deferring line expansion or even substation expansion deferral. Also on the grid side, using demand response, we see a lot of bulk system operators using it for providing their ancillary service operating reserves, and that is needing to be tracked at the network level as well. And then the next major category of advancement in demand response has been what I call DR 2.0. So this is using your demand response to provide a balancing resource, either direction of reduction or consumption, depending on the balancing needs at the moment. So this is different from the previous stages in that at certain times you may need to ramp up your electricity consumption, not just ramp it down, right? Or some utilities are using demand response to provide frequency regulation, which is following a rapidly on the order of seconds varying signal to provide frequency regulation to their bulk system for their bulk system needs, or even providing imbalanced energy services. So finally, the ultimate stage in demand response, and these are identified in EPRI DR 2.0 workshop, and they're published in previous EPRI reports. But the ultimate stage was to use demand response to be a way to provide elastic demand in a system. But to do elastic demand means you're not just serving you're treating the load as fixed, but the load has different, let's say, cost points where it's willing to be flexible, and that varies by customer facility. It depends on the customer, and the kinds of values and ultimate stages that you could give the customer a choice for green, clean, or even local power, premium power, for more resilient power. In the case of negative prices that we're seeing in many regions with high penetrations of renewable electricity, causing an over generation condition, we see negative pricing and more creative programs like free nights, so free power or very, very cheap power for customers who sign up on that kind of arrangement. Some of the categories of challenges here in connecting this retail demand response to provide that load adjustment coordinated with system market needs is we need flexible retail programs. So programs with provisions, agreements with the customer so that they are going to say they can be dispatched, their load can be dispatched, basically. The load is engaged in a retail program with the provisions for demand response. Also, the wholesale market prerequisites need to be there, just the design, so that when you have the retail programs, the markets are designed so that there's some kind of cost benefit, like you can defer expansion at the bulk system level, or you can reduce your wholesale energy procurement. So market designs to allow for that benefit, the upside of cost avoidance with demand response, and technology enablers to enable automating the response aligned with customer choices surrounding their their flexibility around the electricity assumption to provide that demand response. These are all key elements to connect retail DR with the wholesale market needs. I had mentioned, some key enablers, and I'm just deeper diving into them. One of them is the technologies, such as demand response ready technologies, that could serve as building blocks for that automation of that load adjustment coordinating with system needs, right? So for widespread integration of demand response ready technologies that have built-in functionality. And in this case, we use the term demand response ready for technologies in the mass market sector, so small commercial and residential or domestic customer segments. So these technologies have built-in functionality, so modes of operation that are common, and they're published in standards so that utilities and aggregators, demand response aggregators, know what's available to trigger in based on what they need. So basically, there's a standard around what these devices do that can be engaged for automation of demand response. And there's examples of that around the world of common standards being defined for different end uses, and I've shown some on the right side here in the mass market or residential space. Another key enabler is meeting the market requirements. So utility and wholesale operators have sometimes two-way communication requirements. You'll see that more and more with the advanced stages beyond DR 1.0. But for DR to provide a balancing resource, often you need two-way communications. Sometimes you need real-time two-way communications, and that's where telemetry requirements are typically found. And like for frequency regulation, often it's required that there's a real-time heartbeat or visibility to that and use resource at a resource aggregate level. And so this is a challenging area, and we have a public report referenced here on the bottom, available on the EPRI website, EPRI.com, about a demonstration of alternatives to lower telemetry costs. So I have just two more slides. The relationship of, I mentioned the third prong, which is the retail programs, the importance of them. And in the Western regions of the world, we see more and more attention on retail programs that are somehow using some type of retail pricing, right? And you might have heard the term price to device. That's the idea of there's some kind of price out there, and that the retail customers would have visibility and somehow be paying some kind of retail price, right? And a lot of folks, economists, are pro real-time prices exposure to retail customers, and maybe some can handle it, but a lot have to budget, especially if they're a business, and it helps to know what their rates are, right, rather than having a fluctuating price, although some folks mentioned about hedging strategies. But in any case, this slide is showing the relationship of wholesale and retail market prices. And the wholesale level, you have different sources of your costs. So, and if you really have an organized wholesale market, like we have independent system operators, 7 of them in North America, and they have capacity, products, energy reserves, regulation, and they all have price streams flowing out. Okay, so there's different costs and there's different price streams at the wholesale level, and then you have your retail uplifts at the distribution level for distribution capacity, power quality charges, loss compensation, delivery charges. There's uplifts, and then at the end, if we're going to have a retail demand response pricing program, the question for pause here is, okay, real-time pricing of what here? Because there's all kinds of different costs and price streams from end to end, and the provision of electric service at the bulk level down to the distribution level as well. So that's a challenge of coming up with a retail DR pricing program that's based on a real-time price. Finally, the summary here of the presentation is there are a lot of challenges to align these retail programs with the wholesale market needs, and we covered three main aspects shown here. market designs, retail programs, designs, and enabling technologies. But they are key prerequisites for end-to-end integration from retail to wholesale needs. And market and program evolution is occurring. And we saw the ultimate stage was flexibility and customer choice being key. And then the importance of advancing DR standards we touched on, like coming up with standards for what these demand response ready technologies would do as building blocks to enable automation of that response to get that widespread coordination of demand response from customers to support grid and market needs. So with that, we can pause for any comments or questions.
Thanks, Angela. We have in the audience practitioners of pricing from ESCOM and demand response as well, and people that are involved in transmission planning. I would like to give them an opportunity to ask any questions that are relevant to their practice.
There's one on the chat from Mondi Sony. Do you guys have cases where you have proposed DR to solve transmission or distribution network overloading? More details, please. Oh yeah, there's a lot of examples of at least pilots going on right now. I'll give one in California where they're looking at electric vehicle supply equipment, EVSC, so the charging stations, to be able to support the ISO, the California Independent System Operator, for example, to provide demand response and to be compensated by the ISO. Utilities at the retail level also have their electric vehicle charging pilots. And there are big programs that go along with these demand response programs, multi-billion dollars devoted to EVSC infrastructure that are including, excuse me, our distribution utilities programs to basically provide rebates for EVSCs that meet a charge-ready criteria, like a DR-ready or charge-ready criteria in California, defined by the California Independent, the investor-owned utilities, the 3 investor-owned utilities in California. So there's the rebates for the adoption of these charge-ready EVSCs in California, and then there's the charge-ready EVSC programs for demand response. So there are examples like that you can find in pilot stage for newer technologies like EVSC, but in full-blown program stage for using more classical means like curtailment and interruptible programs. All right. There are also battery DR programs to support deferral of substation expansion that we can point to in EPRI reports. Would be interesting to see our metros distributors implementing. Yeah, very, very much so. And we can point to other reports EPRI's published along those lines. Are these programs mainly aimed at time of use customer tariffs? Well, I would say that if it depends on what the objective is, okay? Time of use tariffs need to be defined in advance, right? And there's just so much you can do with that kind of program. You might be able to use it to capture forward economics on a day-ahead basis, but there needs to be some dispatchability element to capture those real-time type of needs. So you can't just rely on time of use necessarily without dispatchability if you want to do DR 2.0, for example. And so I wouldn't say these programs are, but I would say the overall movement in some regions is to see how to get more and more customers on time of use so that they can have advanced, type of coordination capability of the load aligned with the system needs on a day-ahead basis at least. But for a real-time, like dispatchability element, time of use doesn't necessarily connotate that, right? So the DR programs, typically of the system operators like the ISOs, they require some form of dispatchability element in the retail program. So they don't typically rely on just time of use tariffs.
Just a quick thanks to the team here from my side. Thanks, Barry, and we hope to hear from you guys again in future. Thanks. That's all I just wanted to say. Thank you. Get on, Marcus.
Yes, thank you very much to Ron, Barry, Chris, and Angela. Your preparation was very much appreciated, and I think this has opened our eyes to the depth of DR that you are gaining control of on your side. Much appreciated.
All right. Bye, guys.
Okay, cheers then.
Bye.
Thank you,
Take
Angela.
care, bye-bye.
Cheers, everyone.